The county had already made up its mind before Marisol Doyle ever set foot on the property. At the feed store checkout line, at the diner where the same four men drank the same coffee every morning at 6. Outside the Presbyterian church, where opinions traveled faster than scripture, the verdict was unanimous and delivered without hesitation. A woman who'd spent her entire career plating other people's food in a Harrisburg restaurant had just signed her name to 70 acres of ground that hadn't produced anything but thistle and regret in over a decade. The math didn't work, the background didn't fit, and the land itself had been saying no to everyone for the better part of 2 years. So why did she look at the same wreckage every farmer in Franklin County had already driven past and dismissed and see something none of them could? She was 34. She had managed restaurants for 12 years, good ones. The kind where the head chef cared whether the arugula came from a truck that had been on the road for 3 days or from a farm 40 minutes away. She'd built a career making other people's kitchens run on time. Placing orders for produce she didn't grow, tracking invoices for vegetables she'd never planted, and watching margins bleed every season as the cost of sourcing anything fresh from anywhere close kept climbing. It was a stable job, she was good at it, and by the end of year 10 the stability had started to feel less like security, and more like a slow kind of suffocation, the particular exhaustion of knowing exactly how every week would end before it began. Somewhere in those final 2 years behind the desk, between calls to distributors and complaints about wilted greens that had traveled too far in trucks too warm, the idea took shape. Not gradually, more like a crack in a wall she'd been leaning against for a decade, widening until she couldn't pretend it wasn't there. She didn't want to order the food anymore. She wanted to be the one growing it. The property she found had a name attached to it the way abandoned places often do, not as a title but as a kind of epitaph, the Kepler place. Elmer Kepler had worked that ground for close to half a century, a man who'd outlasted drought and debt and shifting markets through sheer repetition, doing the same work in the same fields in the same order until arthritis locked his hands and age pulled him off the tractor seat for the last time sometime in his late 80s. His children had grown up watching their father's back bend a little more each year and had chosen, independently and without much discussion among themselves, lives that kept them far from fences and soil. When Elmer passed, they carved the land into parcels and sold them off piece by piece to neighbors and developers and anyone willing to make an offer, the last 70 acres farthest from the main road. Steepest in grade, most overgrown, sat listed on the county market for 24 months without a single serious bid. The price dropped twice. The listing agent stopped returning calls about it. And then Marisol made the only offer anyone had been willing to make, at a figure low enough that the clerk processing the deed asked her not unkindly but with genuine confusion whether she'd read the listing correctly. What she'd bought announced itself plainly in the first week. Pastures that had gone unmanaged for more than a decade had stopped being pastures entirely. Multiflora rose and autumn olive had colonized the open ground, tangling with volunteer ash saplings into thickets dense enough that standing inside them cut visibility to less than 20 feet in every direction. The greenhouse, a structure that had probably been Elmer's pride at some point, based on how carefully the original frame had been welded, stood with more broken panes than whole ones, its irrigation lines split open by 10 winters of freeze and thaw that nobody had been around to prevent. The barn listed visibly eastward, far enough that the contractor Marisol hired for an assessment told her flatly to keep anything valuable out of it until the framing was addressed. And the tractor, an old International harvester, parked in the exact spot where Elmer Kepler had apparently climbed off it for the last time, sat with its tires rotted flat against the dirt. Engine fused with rust, mice nested deep in the remains of the seat cushion, as if the machine itself had decided that whoever came next was someone else's problem. A cattle rancher named Dwayne Federoff, who'd worked the adjoining land for 3 decades without interruption, walked over during that first week with the particular confidence of a man who'd never had to start anything from scratch. He studied the tractor the way a doctor studies an X-ray he already knows the answer to, and told Marisol with the bluntness of someone who considered diplomacy a waste of daylight that she'd have saved money and time buying a running machine outright instead of trying to resurrect one that far past saving. Marisol thanked him, And then she kept working. She'd already decided during those final months in Harrisburg, while she was still signing produce invoices and pretending the crack in the wall wasn't there, that she wouldn't farm this land the way Elmer had farmed it. She'd spent that last year reading everything available on regenerative agriculture, cover cropping, rotational grazing, building soil biology from the ground up instead of pouring purchased inputs on top of it. It wasn't idealism that drew her to it. It was arithmetic. She didn't have the capital to farm the conventional way, even if she'd believed in it. What she had was time, an uncommon tolerance for being underestimated, and a quiet conviction that the ground beneath all that brush was better than anyone currently alive in the township was willing to believe. That first summer taught Marisol the difference between reading about hard work and living inside it. She cleared brush by hand and with a rented brush hog, working in sections across ground that hadn't seen a blade or a boot in so long it had forgotten what either felt like. The pastures closest to the old feeding areas, places where Elmer's cattle had once stood in the same spots day after day. Season after season, packing the earth under their weight had compacted into something closer to pavement than soil. She could press a shovel into certain patches and feel the resistance of ground that had given up on being porous. Other sections, where the brush had grown thickest, were softer underneath but so choked with root mass that every cleared row revealed another layer of root beneath it. It was repetitive, punishing, deeply undramatic labor, the kind of work that doesn't photograph well, doesn't condense into a time-lapse, and only makes sense to the person doing it because they're the only one who remembers what the same patch looked like the morning before. The tractor sat where it had been sitting for years, rusting in place with the patience of something that had already accepted its own irrelevance. Marisol had no mechanical training. Nothing in 12 years of managing restaurant kitchens had prepared her for the inside of a diesel engine. But a retired mechanic named Walt Siak, who operated a small independent repair shop on the far side of town and had spent 40 years bringing machines back from conditions most shops would have refused, took a different kind of interest when Marisol showed up with photographs of the seized engine and asked what it would cost to make it turn over again. Walt gave her a number for the labor. Then he paused and offered something else almost as an afterthought, the way people sometimes offer the more valuable thing second to see if you're paying attention. If she wanted to learn the work, instead of just paying for it, he'd walk her through the entire rebuild on weekends. His rate for teaching was considerably less than his rate for doing. The difference was time, and time was the one currency Marisol had more of than money. They spent July and August in Walt's shop. Marisol learned to free a piston fused to the cylinder wall by years of moisture and neglect, to flush a fuel system clogged with sediment older than some of the marriages in the township, and to rebuild a carburetor with hands that still carried the smell of kitchen degreaser from a career she was only beginning to leave behind. Walt corrected her mistakes directly. Without softening them, she made fewer of them each week. By September, the International Harvester turned over on the second attempt. The engine ran rough, uneven idle, a knock in the lower register that Walt said would settle once the fuel system fully cleared itself, but it ran. Marisol drove it back to the farm herself, down the county road at a speed that barely registered on the speedometer, past Dwayne Fedorov's fence line. Dwayne came outside. He didn't wave. He didn't say anything. He just stood at his fence and watched the machine he'd declared unsalvageable roll past under its own power, driven by the woman he'd advised to give up on it. Some moments don't require commentary. The image carries everything the words would only dilute. The greenhouse came back that same fall. Marisol sourced replacement glass through a salvage dealer 2 counties east, buying in bulk to keep the per pane cost low enough that the project didn't collapse under its own budget. She replaced every broken pane individually, working from the south wall to the north over the course of several weeks, and rebuilt the cracked irrigation lines herself after consuming enough instructional videos to feel dangerous and then enough additional ones to feel competent. It was not elegant work. Several of the replacement panes didn't match the originals in thickness. 2 of the irrigation joints leaked for a week before she redid them, but when she finished, the structure held water and held heat. And that was what it needed to do. The following spring she planted a diversified rotation of vegetables, not the commodity crops her neighbors grew for wholesale buyers, but the specific lettuces. brassicas, herbs, and root vegetables that the farm-to-table restaurants in Harrisburg ordered week after week from suppliers who shipped them in refrigerated trucks from farms 3 states distant. Marisol knew those orders by heart. She'd placed them herself for over a decade. She knew which chefs needed which varieties at which volumes during which weeks of the season. Because she'd spent 12 years on the buying end of exactly those phone calls, it was, if anyone had bothered to ask her instead of repeating the same speculation at the feed store counter, the single most logical piece of the entire operation. She wasn't guessing at a market, she'd lived inside it. The pasture work followed a different logic entirely. A rotational grazing consultant named Priscilla Whitmore, contracted through the State Conservation District for a single on-site visit, walked the cleared ground with Marisol that spring, testing compaction with a penetrometer, cataloging whatever forage species had survived the years of neglect, mapping water access points across the property's lower elevations. Together they designed a system built on portable electric fencing, lightweight, inexpensive, movable to rotate a small starter herd of 12 beef cattle through the pastures in tight groups, shifting them to fresh ground nearly every day during the growing season. The principle was old. Herds in the wild had always moved this way, grazing an area intensively, fertilizing it, and moving on before the plants were chewed past their recovery point. Modern continuous grazing, the kind Dwayne and most of the county practiced, kept animals on the same ground indefinitely, which was simpler to manage and slowly destructive in ways that only showed up in soil tests most operations never bothered to run. Marisol's system demanded more of her daily attention than any conventional setup would have. Moving fence every morning, monitoring grass height, tracking recovery windows, but it demanded almost nothing from her bank account. No purchased fertilizer, no herbicide, no feed supplements through the growing season. And when Priscilla returned that fall to pull soil cores from the pastures Marisol had been rotating cattle through for 5 months, the organic matter readings had climbed measurably in ground that had been compacted and biologically inert for years under Elmer Kepler's final exhausted seasons of management. It was the kind of progress that didn't announce itself from the road. A neighbor driving past at 40 miles an hour would have seen the same rough pastures and the same modest herd and concluded nothing much had changed. But 4 inches below the surface, in the space where roots either find something to hold on to or don't, the soil was becoming something it hadn't been in a long time. And Marisol, who checked it on her hands and knees with a frequency that would have struck most of her neighbors as obsessive, was the only one who knew. The discovery that rearranged how the rest of the township thought about the Kepler place arrived the way most consequential things do, without announcement, without preparation, in the middle of an ordinary task on an ordinary afternoon. July had been dry, not catastrophically dry, not the kind of drought that makes regional news and triggers emergency declarations, but the steady, accumulating kind that turns pasture grass from green to straw-colored over the course of 3 weeks and leaves cattle ranchers checking stock tanks with increasing frequency and decreasing optimism. Marisol had been watching her pastures fade along with everyone else's, adjusting her rotation schedule to give each paddock more recovery time, accepting the math of less rain producing less grass producing less carrying capacity. It was the arithmetic every livestock operation in the county was running simultaneously, and none of them were happy with the answer. Then she noticed something she couldn't account for. A patch of vegetation in the lowest corner of the lower pasture, maybe a 1/4 acre, tucked against a slope where the property line curved toward Dwayne Fedorov's boundary, had stayed green, not slightly less brown than its surroundings, conspicuously, almost defiantly green, as if that particular piece of ground had decided the drought was someone else's problem. Marisol walked out to it on a Thursday afternoon, expecting to find a leaking water line or a drainage issue she'd missed during her initial survey of the property. What she found instead was something considerably older than any water line she'd installed, buried under decades of leaf litter, fallen branches, and the accumulated debris of a landscape left to its own devices for longer than most of the people in the township had been farming, was a spring box, a concrete collection structure hand-poured. From the look of it, with the kind of rough craftsmanship that suggested a time when farmers built infrastructure with whatever materials they had and whatever labor they could supply themselves. The box had been designed to capture groundwater, where it surfaced naturally against the slope, channeling it into a basin from which it could be piped or gravity-fed to wherever it was needed. At some point long before Elmer Kepler's tenure on the land, based on how completely the undergrowth had swallowed the structure, someone had capped it, sealed the outflow, and apparently decided that the water surfacing in that corner of the property was no longer worth managing. Marisol mentioned the find to Dwayne Federoff. Not because she sought his approval, that particular dynamic had resolved itself quietly somewhere around the day the international harvester rolled past his fence, but because he was the neighbor she encountered most frequently at the shared mailbox. And the discovery seemed like the kind of thing a man who'd farmed the adjoining property for 30 years might have context for. Dwayne walked out to see it himself, and for the first time since Marisol had known him, he looked at something on her property without the expression of a man preparing to explain why it wouldn't work. He studied the old concrete, ran his hand along the basin's edge where decades of mineral deposits had built up in layers like tree rings marking years of uninterrupted flow, and told her what he knew. Spring boxes like this one had been standard practice across the county 100 years earlier, before rural electrification made drilled wells and electric pumps the cheaper and more convenient option. Farmers had capped them, buried them, tiled over the wet ground they fed, and moved on to pressurized systems that didn't require gravity or topography to function, it had seemed. At the time, like progress, like fixing a problem. But Dwayne said something else too, and the way he said it carried the weight of a man reconsidering something he'd believed for a long time without examining it closely. In a county where water tables had been tightening for years, where rainfall patterns had grown less predictable with each passing season, where half the livestock operations in the township had spent the last 2 dry summers hauling water to stock tanks from the municipal supply at rates that climbed every year, a functioning spring capturing groundwater at this volume wasn't a curiosity. It was, by a margin most people driving past would never appreciate, the most valuable thing on the entire property. Marisol spent 2 weekends clearing the spring box properly. She chipped out a cracked section of the original concrete basin and patched it. She ran a simple gravity-fed line, no pump, no electricity. No moving parts from the collection box down the natural slope to a new stock tank positioned in the lower pasture where her cattle could reach it without crossing fence. The system worked the way gravity has always worked, which is to say reliably and without a monthly bill. Her herd now drank from water that had been filtering through limestone and shale for longer than the county had existed, surfacing into a structure built by hands that history had forgotten, flowing into a tank managed by a woman most of the township had expected to fail before her first winter. The part that changed the conversation in town wasn't the spring itself. It was what the spring implied, if one forgotten water source had been sitting buried on the Kepler place for decades, capped and abandoned by a generation of farmers who'd decided wet ground was a nuisance rather than an asset. How many others were out there? How many springs had been sealed across the township during the same era of drainage tiling that had turned every low-lying wet spot into a target for elimination? How much water was still moving underground through the same fractured limestone that fed Marisol's spring, surfacing into collection structures that nobody alive remembered building, buried under brush that nobody had cleared because nobody had a reason to look? Dwayne Federoff, who had spent 2 consecutive summers paying to haul water to his own stock tank during the worst of the dry stretches, asked Marisol, with none of the confidence that had characterized his earlier advice, whether she thought a similar spring might exist somewhere on his land. The two of them spent an afternoon that September walking his property with an aerial survey map Dwayne had inherited from his father and never thought to study for this particular purpose. Near the northern boundary, in a low area that had been tile drained sometime in the early 1960s and converted to marginally productive hay ground that flooded inconveniently every wet spring, they found what they were looking for. Evidence not conclusive, but persuasive of a second spring, capped and buried during the same era that had treated subsurface water as a problem best solved by making it go away. Within weeks, 2 other farmers in the township, neither of whom had previously expressed any interest in Marisol's methods or philosophy, had started pulling old drainage records from the county conservation office. requesting historical aerial photographs from the state archive, and walking their own low-lying ground with a new question in mind. Not whether they had water problems, whether they'd been solving the wrong problem for 60 years. By the time the one-year anniversary of the purchase came around the following spring, the conversation at the feed store had changed in a way that would have been difficult to predict 12 months earlier. Not dramatically small towns don't reverse their opinions with the speed or enthusiasm of people who enjoy admitting they were wrong, but measurably the greenhouse was operating at full capacity, supplying 3 Harrisburg restaurants with a rotating selection of produce through most of the growing season, ordered by chefs who had once placed those same calls to Marisol when she sat on the other side of the desk. The pastures, still visibly rough, still years away from what anyone would mistake for a catalog photograph, were carrying a herd that had grown from 12 cattle to 20 without a single dollar spent on purchased feed. The soil tests confirmed what the grass was already demonstrating: organic matter climbing in ground that had been biologically exhausted for years, recovering at a pace that wouldn't make headlines but would, given enough seasons, make the kind of difference that outlasts headlines entirely. Dwayne Federoff, asked about the operation at the feed store by someone who remembered his original prediction clearly enough to quote it back to him, admitted he'd been wrong, not partially, not with caveats designed to protect the part of the assessment he could still defend. He said it plainly. The way a man speaks when he's decided that honesty costs less than maintaining a position the evidence no longer supports. He'd expected the farm to collapse a woman with no agricultural background trying to rehabilitate ground the county had written off. What he'd watched instead was something he didn't have a ready vocabulary for. A slower, more deliberate kind of success than his 30 years of conventional farming had trained him to recognize, one assembled not from any single dramatic gesture, but from 1,000 unglamorous decisions made correctly, day after day, by a person with an uncommon immunity to discouragement. Marisol. When people asked her about the first year, and by spring they were asking with genuine curiosity rather than the performative concern that had characterized the earlier inquiries, never described it as vindication. She didn't frame it as proof that her doubters had been wrong, or as evidence that her way of farming was superior to theirs. She talked about soil aggregate stability, about mycorrhizal colonization rates in pastures that had been biologically silent for a decade, about the specific satisfaction, and she used that word, satisfaction, not triumph, not victory, of watching a restaurant she'd once managed plate a salad assembled entirely from seeds she'd started in a greenhouse she'd repaired with her own hands, grown in soil she'd rebuilt with methods most of her neighbors still regarded with polite skepticism. It was the kind of closed loop that most people in agriculture talk about theoretically, and almost nobody achieves in practice. And Marisol described it with the same understated precision she'd once used to describe a well-run dinner service. Everything in its place, everything arriving on time, nothing wasted. But underneath the technical language, underneath the soil readings and the rotation schedules and the careful accounting of inputs saved and outputs, gained the same instinct that had made her sign. A deed nobody else would sign was still running. Quieter now, less desperate than it had been during those final suffocating months behind the restaurant desk, but identical in its fundamental architecture, a belief, not a hope, not a wish, but the kind of belief that writes, checks and moves furniture and drives, sees tractors down county roads at 5 miles an hour, that 70 acres of ground the world had given up on still held something worth finding. That the work was not in adding to it but in clearing away what didn't belong and waiting, with a patience most people find intolerable, for what remained underneath to reveal itself. The greenhouse windows caught the early light now the way they must have caught it when Elmer Kepler was still young enough to notice. The tractor started on the first try every morning, its engine running with the rough steadiness of something that had been given a second chance and intended to make use of it. And in the lowest corner of the lower pasture, water that had been moving through limestone in the dark for longer than anyone in the county had been alive, kept surfacing into a concrete box built by hands that history had forgotten, flowing downhill into a stock tank that hadn't gone dry once, not during the driest week of the driest month of a summer that had left half the township hauling water at prices they couldn't afford to keep herds alive on ground they couldn't afford to let go. If you want to find out what Marisol uncovers next on the Kepler place and whether Dwayne Fedorov ever breaks ground on that buried spring at his northern boundary, stay close. This was only the first year, and the land, it turns out, has been keeping more secrets than anyone around here thought to ask about.